This afternoon, we will have presentations by Commanding General, United States Army Training Center in Fort Jackson, Brigadier General Milford Beagle, Jr., a pre-recorded presentation from the Commander, Australian Defence Force College, Major General Mick Ryan, Lieutenant General Wayne Eyre, Commander of the Canadian Army, and Commanding General of the United States Training and Doctrine Command, General Paul Funk II, with closing remarks from Major General Patrick Donahoe, Commanding General, Maneuver Center of Excellence. Again, we would like to remind everyone to visit our pre-recorded Maneuver Warriors Corners at your convenience. And also, just a reminder, once a session is completed, you must return to the agenda page and click on the next session to view it. Our next speaker of the day served in key leadership positions from Lieutenant to Brigadier General in light and mechanized formations over the last 28 years in the United States Army. He has operational combat tours in Korea, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the privilege to introduce the Commanding General, United States Army Training Center and Fort Jackson, Brigadier General Milford Beagle, Jr.
Good afternoon. I'm Brigadier General Biggs Beagle, the Commanding General of Fort Jackson, South Carolina, home of Training and Doctrine Commands and our Army's largest basic training center. I've been afforded a few moments to discuss leader development. I'm thankful and grateful for the opportunity, and I want to jump right into it. I feel honored to present today, and as I'm sure that senior leaders before and after me have touched on some very critical, profound, and even eye-opening aspects of leader development. But what I intend to do is discuss leader development from a basic perspective. We use phrases such as get back to the basics, start with the fundamentals, and the like. But what are the basics of leader development? Stated another way, what one thing must we overcome, even at a basic level, in order to make leader development effective? What prevents leaders from being effective leader developers? And why do some respond to leader development in some settings, but not in others? The answer is simple. It's fear. Now that you're interested, what's fear got to do with leader development? Definitely it's non-doctrinal approach. I know it, but please entertain me. The short answer is everything. Now, many of you are probably thinking this is a lot of philosophical mumbo jumbo. Really, it's about overcoming fear in order to get to the essence of leader development. Now, let's think about it in the most basic way. A leader that I respect and that many of us know accurately captures it well. Lieutenant General Jim Rainey states that a majority of his learning and development occurred in the operational force. Now, I think most of us would tend to agree. But why is that? The answer is in another question. What would you attempt to do if you know you would not fail? The answer is you would do everything to include learn, put what you've learned into practice, and attempt to do more things. You wouldn't fear failing because you know that you wouldn't fail, right? So we often speak about adaptive, innovative, agile leaders and leaders of character. A word that should make it to the list is fearless. Think of those leaders that we admire and often discuss. How did they garner the admiration of others who developed them? How were they developed? More importantly, who underwrote their failures so that for the sake of allowing them to learn as part of their development? To apply our knowledge, skills, and experience, we must be willing and comfortable with failing. He or she who learns quicker, fails more, and more frequently. We don't like the word fail, but it is not counter to our mindset of winning. We've all heard the saying. We learn in two ways: significant emotional event, and some of you may refer to that as blunt trauma, or repetition. So what does this look like at the basic level? And can it be applied as we look at leader development beyond the basic level? So you may ask, what's a new recruit afraid of when they enter or arrive to basic training? The short answer is they're afraid of everything. The 17 to 24-year-old, they're afraid of the drill sergeant, they're afraid of the challenges ahead, they're afraid of each other actually. They're afraid of themselves because they don't know what they're capable of, and most of all, they're afraid of failing. So how do you break that barrier? We allow them to fail. From failure comes growth. You learn from failure. You adapt to failure, and you grow from failure. So to put it all into perspective, the leaders that we want to develop may embrace education, but be hesitant or reluctant or afraid to put it into practice. The leaders that we want to develop may possess a high level of inquisitiveness in their self-study, but be hesitant, reluctant, or afraid to pursue their inquiries. We may even stifle what we desire by not properly embracing or fostering discipline initiative or mission command. So how do we foster being fearless in our learning and development from the basic level into advanced levels through a process defined as leader development? At the basic level and in our operational experiences, we learn more and we develop faster due to acceptable failures being embraced by an individual and organizations who are not afraid to fail or accept failing as a learning action. But as you can see from Edgar Dale's cone of experience, and oh, by the way, this was developed in 1946, we learn best in active and dynamic environments. And those that develop better faster can attest to multiple failures along the way. So it makes sense that we feel we learn more in those active environments. It's basic. Think of one of the most developmental assignments or experiences and what comes to mind first, a failure or a success? Or is a failure that led to a success the first thing that comes to your mind? So similar to what we can achieve at the basic level, set the conditions to break the barrier of fear to learning and development. We must be able to do the same in active and passive environments, our self-development, as well as our institutional domains. So start your next leader development session, whether it be self-development in a classroom or in a field environment, with the fundamental question to your leaders. What would you attempt to do if you know you would not fail? At the basic level, we answer this question every day. By showing up to basic training, many have already answered the question. Some are certain of their desired outcome. Failure is not an option. Many others are not so certain. Failure is a possibility. But at the end of the day, many have learned to turn fear to confidence and failure to success. They've also learned be, know, do. And although we don't use that mantra any longer, they do things they've been taught through repetition. They know and learn how to do things better because they try and fail, they try again and succeed. And they be more confident in the member of the team and emerging leader that we desire. In essence, they've been developed. Recognition by a leader that you've demonstrated growth and greater potential to learn from an act of failure to advance your knowledge, skills, and abilities is a great thing. We can't afford or allow fear or failure to be a barrier to meeting our own doctrinal tenets of successful leader development. It is an enabler at the individual level, the unit level, or in our institutional, operational, and self-study domains. We must learn how to harness it, like we easily achieve in active environments, and ensure our leaders understand it as we focus on developing them into adaptive, innovative leaders of character that we desire. Victory starts here. Army strong. Winning matters.
This is Colonel Budahas, Chief of Staff at Fort Benning. How do you read the station?
Hey, Chris, it's Tim Framues at Fort Jackson. I hear you well.
All right. Hey, thanks, Tim. Hey, Tim, we got a series of questions from the field for you. Number one, as General Beagle has spoken to, and a number of senior leaders in professional forums have recently discussed, officers and soldiers are being, allowing a culture where officers and soldiers should be allowed to fail in order to learn. How do we, as leaders, create such a organizational culture where positive learning can occur through failure?
Thanks for that question. Good thing you started off with the easy one. So a couple of things to talk about with General Beagle is when we looked at this presentation, one of the things can be done is to refocus the after action review. So we change our stance and tone from assessing responsibility for any failures that occur in a training event, which could be conveyed as assessing blame, and then encourage learning and leader development through that trial and error process. So, you go through trial and error, try again, or try, fail, then try again, succeed, as General Beagle spoke about. But offering that opportunity to reset, and then the acceptance that in a training iteration, we're not always going to be successful in the first time, and get away from a culture or a perspective that you have to be a first time go in order to be successful. Another approach is to foster the candor and share failure experiences with subordinates. If we've failed and we've arrived at a leadership position and progressed to increasing levels of responsibility, that's one way to encourage that opportunity for others to try, fail, try again, and succeed, and get into that cycle. And then the last thing I'll offer as an answer to that question is that if we invest and design the iterative time in our training events to account for that try, fail, try again, and succeed iterations, it will better set the organization and learning culture for that organization.
Thanks, Tim. And the next question from the field is the following. The title of Brigadier General Beagle's session is, and I quote, "The Basics of Leader Development," unquote. Based on the changing nature of war, what, if any, basics in traditional leader development methods need to be changed in the generating or operating forces to develop more effective leaders?
So I think there's two parts to this, I think, as well. So one of the things looked at for basic training is that, the approach to get the shock value of the shark attack, that's sort of a legacy of the draft army. So changing that method and approach from basic training and setting conditions for those senior instructors, drill sergeants, cadre members, as coaches, teachers, mentors who are invested in the outcomes of the soldiers who are going through training. The other part of that is that recognizing that this generation of volunteers are a little more technically savvy. So changing our approach to how we present instruction, how we do the iterations, and how we enable them to practice, have iterations where they are unsuccessful, reset, another iteration where they are successful, but also incorporating technology so we can get some of those things that they're used to, whether it's iPads or that approach to training, to just kind of get this into not only just training and learning, but learning and education combined. Over.
Thanks, Tim. We got a couple questions reference the Drill Sergeants Academy. How has or is the Drill Sergeants Academy evolving its POI to convert citizen volunteers into effective soldiers?
They're doing some of those things that I think that are most effective from the Drill Sergeant Academy's POI is incorporating some of the ready and resilience training into the instructions for the individuals who are going to serve in these key roles, making them more open to that iterative learning experience and being more aware of those individuals and their ability to accept that information over time. We still have the basics and the tenets of soldiership that is in that Drill Sergeant Academy, but having that one other aspect of looking at their ability to recognize an individual's ability to learn, uptake that information, practice that, and then go through that process in order to become more proficient in those key tasks.
Thank you very much. The next question we received is, what are some of the major training events at Fort Jackson through the POI which you're conducting that allows trainees to fail in order to allow them to grow?
So iteratively going through key field training exercises, hammer, anvil, and forge, progressing with that culminating event of the forge, which is the longest and most taxing part of the POI. It gives that opportunity for those small groups. So basic training, is originally was broken down to red, white, and blue phases, progressing. Now we've got the yellow phase to account for our controlled monitoring in a COVID environment. But getting individual skills that build and lead to those team skills that can become, we're not really going to get to a collective efficiency in training, in basic combat training, but getting them to become integral members of the team. And whether it's lanes in the crawl, walk, run methodology for each of those key training events, they all compound to that ability for a soldier to reset, relearn. One additional piece is that as the leaders assess their training cycle and individuals in that cycle, we do retain that ability to keep that individual from progressing to a next phase and resetting them into another organization that's coming up behind into that phase, and reset that phase both to gain additional physical fitness to progress, and then the skill sets that they need to master in that phase before they progress on. Over.
Thanks, Tim. Got a couple questions reference platoon leaders at basic training. Question is, does Fort Jackson have basic training platoon leaders, and how effective are they in assisting in this effort, and how is Fort Jackson developing them to be effective in training basic trainees?
And so that's multiple points to answer that question as well. So we do have the platoon leaders across all of our formations, and that's a great opportunity for the platoon leader to get that leadership experience leading an organization with non-commissioned officers, drill sergeants in those key development positions. But that platoon leader is also reflective of the force. So the soldiers coming through the basic training pipeline see the NCOs are the primary trainers. They've got officers who are coordinating and synchronizing training, but also platoon leaders who are involved in that training. That's one of those key pieces, I think, that the platoon leader enables. It also increases our leader to lead ratio, and it frees up drill sergeants from performing what they had been doing as far as administrative tasks, and they can just focus on some of those key POI tasks. So I think it's kind of a combination of all those efforts, and then those platoon leaders often, they're here for a short period of time because they're coming from an operational assignment, usually not straight out of OBC, and then we get them an opportunity to move into an executive officer position as well, and many of them even get an opportunity to serve on battalion staffs. Over.
Thanks, Tim. So a couple questions here about training the Army of the future. So as the Army looks to 2028, how is CIMT looking to evolve its current training POI to train and prepare soldiers for this future fight?
But I don't want to speak for CIMT in total, but one of the things that we've done at Fort Jackson to help with the CIMT effort is look at what the multi-domain operational capable soldier should have as skill sets. Clearly, we have some basic training standards, physical fitness, weapons, proficiency and marksmanship training that are all part of that. But we're looking at how we can also include the technology piece so that a soldier can, one, operate in a degraded environment, not rely on technology, still have the key skill sets in order to operate in that degraded environment, because we expect that is one of the key operational parameters in that 2028 timeframe. But then looking at what other aspects of education and training enhance the experience. One other task that General Hibbard and General Funk both kind of gave us to look at was what are the opportunities for soldiers to come into basic training and advance. So right now we have there are federal laws that require us to train for a certain amount of time, but if soldiers, recruits come in and they have mastered some of those tests or key skills, how do we maybe shorten that time in basic training to get them into their advanced training to get them back into the operational force? So we're looking at all of that. Over.
Thanks, Tim. So the next question is, how do we train and certify lieutenants to assume command of an OSIT or BCT platoon?
So initially, when we first got the platoon leaders at Fort Jackson, we centralized a platoon leader indoctrination course, kind of a short period of time where they get familiarized with the TRADOC POI and they understand the TRADOC environment, understand their roles and responsibility. And as we matured over time, the two basic training brigades here have taken that on. So the officers arrive, they go through their in processing, and then they go into the brigades, and the brigades are each run their own, basically a platoon leader certification program and introduction to the environment. So they know what those responsibilities are, and they understand their role. Over.
Thanks. Our next question, we got a few questions reference drill sergeant school, specifically attending it. One question is, to be successful at drill sergeant school or academy, what items should a prospective NCO prepare themselves in order to successfully graduate and then serve as a drill sergeant?
So I think one of the number one is to show up physically fit. And physically fit is the foundation for all of these ability to learn the classes, to certify on those programs of instruction, be able to know doctrinally what we want to teach, what are those basic skill sets, and how we are going to test and assess them, and how to integrate, whether regardless of their MOS and background, be able to perform the functions of that drill sergeant as that leader. Clearly, they still need to have the leadership experience. They're going to get opportunities. So, we now have E5 drill sergeants that are arriving into formation, and they have the least amount of leadership experience, but they're still going to be responsible and looked at as from a basic training standpoint as knowing everything about the Army. So we're trying to get that through that drill sergeant process in the academy, get them able to represent what the Army is about with leaders who care for their soldiers and who are invested in that soldier's success. Over.
Tim, thank you very much for your presentation. Any final comments?
So I appreciate the opportunity as a field artilleryman to contribute to the maneuver conference and to represent General Beagle and some of the questions that came from his presentation. So very much thank you for the opportunity, Chris.
Thank you very much. For the group, at this time, we're going to go to a video presented by the Army Talent Management Task Force. As a reminder, at the end of the video, you have to click out of here and then click into the Major General Mick Ryan video. Thank you. Ouch.
Dawn is breaking on what might appear to be another ordinary day in an ordinary Army installation. But not today. Today marks the dawn of a new path for the world's greatest fighting force. Today, the way the Army selects its future battalion commanders is about to change for the better. In a few hours, the first of nearly 800 officers will be arriving here. They are coming from every major Army installation in the U.S. and from every major overseas location, from the Middle East to East and Southeast Asia, from Australia to Africa, and beyond. Over 5 days, these officers, mostly majors and lieutenant colonels, will be the first to undergo a new way to determine who are best fit to be the Army's next battalion commanders. But why the change? Historically, the Army has picked its battalion commanders and officers to serve in key billets using a board to review and assign value to an officer's past performance. Much of the information considered in this process, however, relies strongly on the subjective evaluation of a senior raider. And while the insights of this raider's perception of the officer are critical, they're also limited and don't include other relevant information about the candidate. In short, for such an important decision, too much emphasis is placed on too little information. Or, as the Army Chief of Staff recently noted,
right now we spend more time and money selecting a private to be in the Ranger Regiment than we do on selecting what I would argue is one of the most consequential leadership positions in the Army, our battalion commanders.
Meet J.P. McGee, the Army Major General charged with planning and executing the Army's first iteration of the Battalion Commander Assessment Program. General, we are sitting in the General George Patton Museum in Fort Knox, Kentucky. I want to start just by asking, what is the significance of having this conversation in this setting?
Well, I think it's a great place to have this interview because I think if you look at George Patton, he was someone who had a unique set of talents, and those talents were used to excel our Army in a direction, both in peacetime and combat, to make us better ready to fight a war like World War II, and then actually win a war like World War II. So for an officer who is imbued with so many talents, it's great to be able to sit here and talk to you in his museum about how we're trying to uncover and find those talents in our officer corps today to make sure we put the right leaders in positions that can help lead our Army into the future.
So, General, tell me, why did the Army decide to change how it chooses its future battalion commanders?
The legacy selection system for battalion commanders in the Army has been tried and true and is a very good process. But when we took a look at it, what we realized is it relies on too little information. It wasn't that the system was bad. It's not. It's actually a very good system, and it's really fair. The question was, is this the very best way that we can pick battalion commanders, this critical position for our Army? And I think when we reviewed it, we said there are probably better ways to do it, to add more additional relevant information that might not be included on the officer evaluation report for us to make this decision for the Army about who we're going to put in charge of the sons and daughters of America.
Organizations in government, industry, and professional sports have demonstrated the power of assessment-based selections to identify the best candidates to fill critical positions. Now the Army is using a similar model, tailored to the enterprise, to select battalion commanders. And like the way it considers any new weapon system or platform, the Army tested it first. You conducted a pilot program last year to validate this way of picking battalion commanders. Can you tell me about that program?
All 27 officers who went through this process said that they thought this was a better way to pick battalion commanders, and the Army needed to institute it. We had a panel of 7 general officers who were the panel members in terms of doing the interview process for the candidates. All 7 general officers who participated in that said this is a better way for the Army to pick battalion commanders, and recommended that we add this as a new function.
The candidates are given 45 minutes to read a professional journal article on a military-related topic. Next, they're given an essay prompt and another 45 minutes to respond to that prompt. General, what is being measured by the written assessment?
So the written assessment is a measurement of a candidate's ability to read an essay and then craft an argumentative essay in support of a thesis. We send the scoring rubric to all the candidates so they know that what we're looking at in terms of their writing requirements. Similarly now, we're adding in a writing assessment, so an objective measure, into the officer corps, so the officer corps will know that if they want to rise to the level of being a battalion commander, it's important for them to do the preparation and work to improve their ability as a writer. That's going to make our communications clearer and better, and it's just going to raise the level of performance across the entire officer corps.
I'm wondering, how does the Army account for maybe some unconventional responses from candidates in the written assessment?
So I think if you look at the scoring rubric, which again we've shared with the candidates, originality and freedom of thought is very much part of that, and it's actually a graded part, so I think it's encouraged.
The writing assignment is the first of a battery of tests that will take place over the 5-day period. Major General McGee gave us insight into the remaining assessments and why they were chosen.
So an evaluation is largely a subjective measure. It is what you decide about your subordinates and how you rank them. And so I've served as a senior rater many times. The Army gives me broad guidance in what we're looking at and tells us that as a senior rater, you're supposed to look at potential. But I have wide discretion in how I determine what potential actually looks like. An assessment is something very different. An assessment, as we define it, is objective. And it's the same and it's consistent. So the one piece that every Army soldier is used to in terms of assessments is the APFT. So every 6 months, the Army requires every soldier to take an Army physical fitness test. It consists of 3 events: push-ups for 2 minutes, sit-ups for 2 minutes, and a 2-mile run. The fact that every soldier in the Army knows they're going to be measured in an objective way on that assessment means that they train and prepare in order to be ready for that test. Similarly, we're going to measure them in their verbal communication skills in a fairly unique way. We're going to take a look at their cognitive, non-cognitive functioning, which is also going to be important. So all of these will require officers, in order to prepare for their selection for battalion command, to improve upon these skills that we think are important to have within the officer corps. And you'll see, I believe, over time, a rise in the level of performance in all of these skills that we want to have within the officer corps, just by including it in the selection process for battalion command.
The Army, slowly but surely, is learning more about the knowledge, skills, and behaviors of each officer, which might not be apparent or noted in the subjective legacy approach. Now that the candidates for battalion command have been tested on written communication and physical fitness, they'll take the cognitive and non-cognitive assessment, a valid predictor for advancement into senior ranks. Dr. Jake Goodwin is a behavioral and social science researcher with the Army Research Institute. Dr. Goodwin, tell us more about these cognitive and non-cognitive tests and how they're used in the BCAP.
The tests are designed to assess the potential of the candidates to perform as a battalion commander, as well as really perform as a senior leader as they move beyond battalion command. The tests have 2 different major components, the cognitive components and the non-cognitive components. The cognitive components measure general cognitive ability as well as some other specific cognitive skills that are really related to strategic leadership. The non-cognitive components measure temperament that's related to performance in these types of positions.
The tests that we're using were developed in the 1990s, is that correct?
That's correct. Back in the 90s, we started to identify attributes that were associated with leadership at senior levels in the Army. And we performed a series of research studies that looked at whether these attributes actually predicted someone's career progression, performance in the different positions, and ultimately their ultimate rank of attainment. These studies actually took place over the course of 20 years. So it took a long time for us to gather the data to be able to see which attributes actually predicted for this. So the tests that we're using here at BCAP assess those attributes.
While the tests these officers take are comprehensive, they don't tell a complete story about the candidates. Major General McGee noted the importance of peer and subordinate evaluations to the process.
So this is the largest attempt to gather peer and subordinate feedback to help the Army make a decision in the history of the Army. What has been different is we have actually chosen who the peers and subordinates are in order to gather that information. So we've gone through the records, we've seen who you've worked with, we've seen who's worked for you, and we've sent them surveys. These surveys were deliberately smaller, so they don't take very long. The goal is for them to take about 10 to 15 minutes to fill out. They're based on different attributes and competencies we would like to see within our leaders. And then there are also a series of questions about whether these leaders possess counterproductive leadership traits and how frequently they actually manifest them.
What do you say to critics who would consider the peer and subordinate evaluations a popularity contest?
I understand where those critics would be concerned about whether you have been unpopular sometimes as a leader, whether that would be something that we would consider. And I also understand that sometimes there's a line between whether you're a hard leader who has high standards or someone who's certainly crossed that line. And where that line exists is fairly subjective. I think it is also fair to be concerned that if somebody had a bad experience, maybe it was a low-performing officer who had to be counseled or didn't receive a good evaluation from that officer, that officer would tend to use this tool in order to gain some form of retribution on the officer. I can tell you, after seeing hundreds of these surveys and reading through them, that the soldiers that we've asked, the officers that we've asked, have used this tool incredibly responsibly. And the vast majority of the evaluations on our officers who are coming forward for battalion command are tremendously positive. Okay, so that hasn't shown itself. The other piece of this is that information is all contextualized by a group of very experienced panel members. So a major general, 2-star general, 2 brigadier generals and 2 former brigade commanders, so colonels who have a tremendous amount of experience. They've all led formations, and they understand the nature of leadership isn't mean you always have to make everybody happy, and it's not a popularity contest. And I think the leaders that are sitting on these panels and making these decisions have proven themselves tremendously capable of contextualizing the information, positive or negative, about any one of the candidates.
Dr. Melissa Wolf is a senior research psychologist with the Center for Army Profession and Leadership. She helped develop the peer and subordinate assessment that provides insight into the leadership effectiveness of the candidates for battalion command. What is the assessment designed to tell us about each candidate?
The assessment is basically going to tell us how the leader operates within the demands of battalion command. So the assessment was specifically designed to capture those key behaviors, competencies, and attributes that are known to predict success in battalion command. And we asked a number of their peers and subordinates how they operate. And so this assessment basically gives us a sense of what are their strengths, what are their capabilities, and what are some of their developmental needs relative to what we need out of our battalion commanders.
Does this assessment help detect toxic leadership?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, toxic leadership is something that the Army has been studying for a number of years. And we've actually realized that the phenomenon of toxic leadership is more than just a negative label. It's a series of behaviors, a whole spectrum, from behaviors that are really benign, that people aren't intending to do it, all the way up to really negative behaviors that are abusive, or what's more formally known as toxic. And Army research has shown that many behaviors on that spectrum can contribute to negative outcomes, such as decreased readiness, decreased unit cohesion, decreased disciplined initiative, things that the Army really cares about for accomplishing the missions. And so, yes, this instrument does assess the frequency with which the candidates engage in counterproductive leadership. But that being said, it's the frequency. If you have a bad day and you yell in the unit or yell at someone or lose your temper, that's not necessarily an indication of consistent counterproductive leadership. That's a bad day.
So what have you learned about BCAP candidates through this assessment?
We have learned that we have a lot of really good lieutenant colonels and major promotables out there who are going through this process. The vast majority of individuals are exhibiting the competencies and behaviors that we need them to. They're effective leaders, they delegate well, they create a clear vision. And we're also learning that our peers and subordinates have a really unique insight into their candidates, which is helping us to provide a really rich understanding of the candidates' capabilities.
To Dr. Wolf's point about using subordinates and peers to assess leadership effectiveness, this is only one of many areas considered during the psychological assessment. And as Major General McGee noted, this is the single largest gathering of operational psychologists in the Army. With me now are 3 of them. Colonel Jeffrey McNeil is Director of Psychological Applications for the U.S. Army Special Operations Command and lead operational psychologist for the Battalion Commander Assessment Program. Next, Master Sergeant Ivan Vasquez, Senior Operational NCO, and Major Garen Davenport, Lead Operations Officer for the Assessment Program. Each of you have different roles within the psychological assessment portion of the program, but I want to ask some general questions. Colonel, what is significant about this effort on behalf of the operational psychologists?
I think the first thing that stands out in significance is that we have a team of 35 operational psychologists and operational psychology NCOs from across the Army that have come together for this, and it's really unprecedented to have this many psychologists and operational psych NCOs to support an assessment program.
Can you tell me, what is the value to the Army of these psychological assessments?
It's focused on suitability attributes rather than a diagnosis or looking at mental, kind of a mental health assessment. That's the important distinction of what operational psychologists bring.
Major Davenport, can you talk about the leadership reaction course?
So basically came out and there's various events on the leadership reaction course, and we went out and looked at, hey, which of these events is going to be most important and help us get the best glimpse at some of what these candidates do, not only as a leader, but also as a follower. So that's really important. So we've been keeping the data, we've been looking at it. All this data goes to the interviewing psychologist.
We're not out here just running any test that we can think of or any assessment just because it's a good idea. Everything is looked at, so if it doesn't make sense or if we're not getting anything of value, there's no sense of putting a candidate through these assessments.
With me is Staff Sergeant Ronnie Morales, Psychology NCO, to further explain the leader reaction course behind us. Sergeant Morales, what are the candidates doing and how does it figure into the assessment?
All right, so what you see these candidates doing here today is tackling some obstacles. So what we're trying to kind of get from these obstacles is how they perform as a leader and as a follower. Some of these obstacles are really challenging. Some of them actually have no solution, have no right answer. Some of them do. We really don't care so much if they're successful at completing the obstacle. We're really more looking at how they engage with their teammates and how they perform as a leader and how they perform as a follower.
I'm catching up with some of the candidates as they complete the LRC. Lieutenant Colonel Ramon Briganti, what are your impressions of the course and the assessment program so far?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity to get a deeper assessment of all the candidates. Typically the board only looks at each file for a very short amount of time, so this goes beyond the paper, and I think it gives the Army leadership a better sense of who we are individually, what our personality traits are, and just how we interact in a social setting.
No assessment for a battalion command posting would be complete without understanding each candidate's leadership capabilities. But what exactly are the psychologists looking for? Major Jess Harmon is one of them. Dr. Harmon, can you tell me what kind of questions the candidates can expect and what you're trying to learn from those questions?
The candidates can expect questions related to their personal and professional backgrounds, their military history, as well as questions about how they perceive themselves and how they interact in their environments outside of BCAP. The purpose of the question is to help the panel members gain information in a limited amount of time to make a decision on their potential for battalion command.
Can you tell me how this assessment differs from other assessments that you've done or that the Army has conducted in the past?
This is not a medical assessment, nor is it a mental health assessment. This is used for purposes of personnel selection for battalion command and future potential.
What value does this program have for the Army?
It allows each candidate an opportunity, more time with the individuals who are making a decision on their future career. And so instead of it being just a packet that's being reviewed, they have the opportunity to sit down and talk through their strengths, their weaknesses, who they are and how they've come here and why it's important for them to move forward. And so I think it gives the candidate an opportunity to share more information as they move forward and a more holistic approach of each candidate as they're being selected for battalion command.
Welcome to the blind panel interview. Depending on your viewpoint, it's either the easiest or the hardest day of the program. The panel is composed of 5 voting members, a 2-star general, 2 1-star generals, and 2 former brigade commanders. There are also 3 non-voting members on each panel, including a panel moderator, a command sergeant major, and a senior psychologist. The panel sits on one side of the partition. The candidate sits on the other. But why a blind interview?
How do you do the best informed process? And we saw a few studies that have been on symphonies. What we found is within symphonies is that when they would audition for new members to join the symphony, they would find that when they would bring someone in, they would have someone play a cello, they would be all evaluated and looked at. The panel members would all vote the proficiency of that cello player in a certain sort of scoring system. But when they erected a screen between them so you couldn't see the player on the other side of the screen, what they found is they made tremendously different choices about who they would pick as a cello player. So we decided to erect that screen in order to see how that would reduce the bias and focus the panel members on really listening to the candidates and then focusing on what we're asking them to evaluate them on, which is their ability to communicate in the verbal form. The other great thing about having that screen between the candidate and the panel is it allows that candidate to be able to speak I think, more freely about some of the issues that come up, not worrying about looking at the panel members, not being distracted by any of their gestures.
What information does the panel have about the candidates during that blind panel interview?
We try to present the relevant information to the panel members so they can make the best informed decision. So they get a holistic view of the candidate based on the psychometric assessments that have been done and the psychological interview. They are able to look at the peer and subordinate feedback that is incorporated in the file of the candidate. They're able to look in a tiered fashion at how the candidates have done on all the assessments that we ran for them.
Over 100 senior Army officers representing units from around the Army serve on the panel. With me are Major General Paul Calvert, Colonel Joe Locke, and Major General Raul Escribano. So can you tell us how the information on this panel differs from other panels you participated in the past?
There's a lot more information that is provided to you in terms of cognitive assessments that you don't have as a part of the selection board process, the way we have done them in the past. I think the information is much richer, but the identity of the officer that is coming before the panel, you don't know. You don't know their background. You don't know their branch. So it's really a blind-on-blind panel.
In the past, it was all about a file review. This time, you get to ask questions. We go back to their behavior at a situation. We see how they behave back in that situation. Then we see how they acted, and then we understand and see how they perform in that particular situation, which helps understand future behavior for the candidates. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for battalion commanders that can perform under a lot of stress, but trying to understand how they're going to perform in the future.
Colonel, can you tell me why you think this process, or if you think it should be used for other selection processes in the future for the Army?
Yeah, I think it's got application there. I'll tell you though, if you think about just the level of importance it is for selecting battalion commanders and the degree of impact that they have on the day-to-day lives of all of our soldiers. If we invest a significant amount of time here picking the right guys for battalion command, the pool of people that can command brigades or command at higher levels is much, much higher. So I think if we get this right, it has just second and third order effects that can't even be measured yet.
As the program winds down, we wanted some parting words from those officers who just completed the Army's first Battalion Commander Assessment Program. Major Armstrong, did the program meet your expectations of what you thought it might be?
I mean, most challenging was probably being resilient as each, assessment was administered. So, as you take an assessment, you're obviously going to go back to that, wonder what you could have done better. But at that point in time, you're faced with another assessment. And so it's a matter of continuing to push forward and trying not to look back too much.
Anytime you do one of these courses, especially one of these that is sort of a first for the Army, you expect there's going to be a lot of friction and a lot of hiccups, but it really exceeded my expectations. Highly professional, consistent, and fair across the board. I felt like the sequencing was excellent, and just the professionalism of the NCOs and the officers that ran this program, I was very impressed.
Can you pinpoint over the last 4 days, what was one of the hardest parts?
I think one of the hardest parts was probably some of the lengthy assessments that we did. I mean, they really sort of dig deep into some of the areas, psychological assessments, cognitive and non-cognitive assessments. But these are all great indicators and lots of data that we can collect over time to where we can make better decisions to put the right people in the right places at the right time.
This really looked at the whole person, your emotional side, your physical side, your mental side, and then just, your strengths and weaknesses. So
For the team, if you're excited about that video, I'd ask you to go to the Warriors Corners and take a look at all the various recordings we have on a variety of subjects to get professionally up to speed on what's happening in your Army. If you will, please back out of this segment and then click into the next session in preparation for Major General Mick Ryan's presentation.